You're standing inside a butcher barn in Holmes County, Ohio in the middle of July. It is 91 degrees outside. Inside this barn, hanging from the ceiling rafters on iron hooks, are 14 slabs of pork belly, 6 whole hams, and approximately 200 pounds of beef in various cuts. None of it is refrigerated. None of it is frozen. The oldest piece in this barn was processed 11 months ago. The man standing beside you walks to a shelf along the back wall, pulls down a mason jar sealed with rendered lard, opens it, slices a piece of the meat inside, and hands it to you. You eat it standing there in the July heat of a barn with no refrigeration, and it is the best cured pork you have ever tasted. No cold chain, no USDA inspection sticker, no refrigerated transport, no electricity consumed from the moment that animal was processed to the moment that meat entered your mouth. Just salt, smoke, lard, time, and knowledge so old it predates the concept of food safety regulation by several thousand years. The cold chain, meaning the unbroken sequence of refrigerated storage and transport that moves food from processing facility to your grocery shelf, consumes approximately 1% of all electricity generated in the United States every single year, according to data published by the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in their Buildings Energy Data Book. 1% of national electricity consumption dedicated entirely to keeping food cold between the place it was processed and the place you buy it. That infrastructure exists not because it is the only way to keep food safe. It exists because it is the most profitable way to create a dependency between you and a system you cannot operate yourself. The Amish figured out 300 years ago that building food security on a foundation that fails the moment electricity does was not security at all. It was a subscription service to a system you do not own. Here is the number that changes everything. The American commercial refrigeration industry generates $48.3 billion annually, according to IBIS World Industry data. The average American household throws away 31.9% of the food it purchases, according to a 2020 study published in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics by researchers at Penn State University led by Dr. Edward Janicka, whose consumer food waste analysis remains one of the most cited in the field. Nearly 1/3 of every grocery bill goes directly into a landfill, primarily because of spoilage, primarily because the modern food system replaced preservation knowledge with refrigeration dependency. The Amish in Holmes County lose less than 3% of their annual food production to spoilage. The gap between 32% and 3% is not technology, it is knowledge. And that knowledge operates through 6 specific methods that the Holmes County community has refined across 300 years of continuous practice. The first method is dry salt curing, and it is the foundation everything else builds on. Salt preserves meat through osmosis. When salt contacts raw meat, it draws moisture out of the tissue and simultaneously penetrates inward, creating an environment so low in available water that bacteria responsible for spoilage cannot sustain their biological functions. The technical measurement of this property is called water activity, expressed on a scale from 0 to 1, where 1 represents pure water, and lower values represent increasing microbial hostility. The USDA's own food safety literature, published through the Food Safety and Inspection Service, acknowledges that a water activity below 0.85 prevents the growth of all common foodborne pathogens including Salmonella, Listeria, and E. coli. Proper dry salt curing drops water activity to between 0.70 and 0.75, well below that threshold. The Amish Cure mixture used across Holmes County contains 3 consistent elements: pure sodium chloride at the base, a nitrate source, historically saltpeter, and in contemporary practice typically celery powder, which contains naturally occurring sodium nitrate that inhibits the specific bacterial pathway responsible for Clostridium botulinum toxin production. And brown sugar, which balances the osmotic draw, contributes to surface pellicle development and moderates the cure's penetration rate through the meat tissue. The cure is applied by hand to every surface of the meat, including joints and cavities. Then the meat rests in ceramic crocks or wooden boxes at cellar temperature between 38 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The curing period is calculated at 1 day per pound of meat plus 2 additional days. A 12-pound ham cures for 14 days, minimum. The meat is turned and redistributed with fresh cure every 3 days to prevent moisture pooling that would create bacterial colonization points and compromise the uniform preservation environment. The second method is cold smoking, and this is where Holmes County preservation moves from safe to exceptional. Cold smoking means maintaining the smokehouse temperature between 70 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit rather than the 180 to 200 degrees used in hot smoking or cooking. At cold smoking temperatures, the meat is not cooked. It is chemically transformed. Research published by Dr. Fidel Toldrá, a food scientist at the Instituto de Agroquímica y Tecnología de Alimentos in Valencia, Spain, whose work on cured meat chemistry is considered foundational in the field, and whose textbook Handbook of Fermented Meat and Poultry is a standard reference in food science programs internationally, documents the mechanism through which phenolic compounds, aldehydes, and organic acids deposited by wood smoke create surface chemistry hostile to bacterial colonization. These compounds bond with proteins in the outer meat layer, creating a surface preservation barrier with documented antimicrobial activity against spoilage organisms that extends shelf stability from days to months. Holmes County Amish smokehouses are small dedicated outbuildings, typically 8 by 10 feet, built from dense hardwood or stone with a tightly fitted door and iron hooks running along the ceiling rafters. The wood burned is exclusively hardwood, primarily hickory with apple and cherry used for specific flavor profiles. Softwoods contain resins that deposit toxic compounds on the meat surface during combustion and are never used. The cold smoking period runs 3 to 7 days of continuous low smoke exposure, maintained through the night by a designated family member who keeps the fire producing consistent smoke without allowing temperature to exceed the cold smoking threshold. This is not a weekend project, it is a multi-day commitment that the Amish approach with the same unhurried thoroughness they bring to every process whose outcome feeds their family through the coming year. The third method is large sealing, and this is the technique that extends preservation from months to years. After cold smoking, the finished meat is packed into ceramic crocks and covered completely in rendered leaf lard. The lard must be rendered completely, meaning all moisture driven out through slow heating and straining, because any residual water in the lard creates a pathway for bacterial infiltration that defeats the entire purpose. Properly rendered leaf lard is essentially pure fat with no water activity. It sets solid at cellar temperature, creating a physical seal around the meat that excludes oxygen and atmospheric moisture completely. Bacteria require oxygen or moisture or both. The lard seal provides neither. The salt pork preserved in this manner in Holmes County cellars has documented storage periods of 3 to 5 years at cellar temperature with no compromise to safety or palatability when evaluated by standard organoleptic and microbiological criteria. Dr. Randy Warrabo, a food microbiologist at Cornell University, whose research on traditional food preservation methods has been published in journals including the Journal of Food Protection and Applied and Environmental Microbiology, has examined the microbial safety of traditional fat-sealed preserved meats and confirmed that the combination of prior salt, curing, smoking, and complete fat encapsulation creates what he describes as a multi-hurdle preservation environment in which each method independently would reduce pathogen viability, and the combination creates conditions where pathogenic growth is effectively impossible across the expected storage period. Multi-hurdle preservation, a framework developed by Dr. Lothar Leistner at the Federal Research Center for Meat Science in Kulmbach, Germany, and published in his landmark 1995 paper in Food Microbiology, describes exactly this principle, that combining multiple preservation stresses each below individually lethal levels creates a cumulative antimicrobial effect superior to any single method applied in isolation. The Amish arrived at this principle through 300 years of observation and refinement. Leistner formalized it in peer-reviewed food science literature in 1995, and it is now foundational to food preservation science globally. The fourth method is lactofermentation, and it represents the most misunderstood preservation pathway in the Amish system. Lactofermentation uses beneficial bacteria, primarily lactobacillus species, to produce lactic acid in the preservation environment. Lactic acid drops the pH of the food product to a level where pathogenic bacteria cannot survive. It is the same principle that makes yogurt, sauerkraut, and sourdough safe and shelf-stable, applied to meat in the form of traditional fermented sausages and what Holmes County families call sour meat, a style of fermented pork preparation that appears in German and Alsatian culinary records going back to at least the 15th century. The fermentation environment is established by inoculating the meat with a small quantity of brine from a previous successful fermentation batch, the same starter culture principle used in sourdough bread. The culture is self-perpetuating. A family that has maintained their fermentation starter across generations is working with a microbial community refined over decades or centuries for exactly the environmental conditions of their specific cellar. Research published by Dr. Luca Coquelin, a food microbiologist at the University of Turin, whose work on fermented meat microbial ecology is widely cited in the international food science literature, demonstrates that traditional fermentation starters maintained across generations develop community stability and pathogen suppression capability that standardized commercial starter cultures cannot replicate. The localized microbial community adaptation that Coquelin's research documents is precisely what makes Holmes County fermented meat products consistently safe, despite operating entirely outside the standardized temperature and time parameters that commercial food safety systems require. The fifth method is dehydration through air drying, and it produces what the Pennsylvania German tradition calls dried beef, or Bündnerfleisch, an air-dried cured beef requiring no smoking, no large sealing, and no fermentation beyond what the salt cure provides. Lean beef cuts, specifically round and eye of round, which contain minimal fat that would otherwise go rancid during drying, are rubbed with the three-component cure and hung in a dedicated drying space with consistent airflow and temperatures between 50 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The drying space in Holmes County farmhouses is typically the upper level of the root cellar or a dedicated north-facing ventilated room where airflow is continuous without direct sunlight exposure. Direct sunlight drives surface temperature above the safe drying range and risks case hardening, a condition where the outer surface dries so rapidly that it seals in moisture rather than drawing it out, creating internal conditions that can support anaerobic bacterial growth despite the surface appearing dry. The beef hangs for 4 to 8 weeks depending on cut thickness, at the end of which water activity has dropped below 0.70 and the product is shelf stable at cellar temperature for 12 to 18 months. The finished product is dense, intensely flavored, and nutritionally concentrated, approximately 3 times the protein density of fresh beef by weight. It requires no further preparation before eating, travels without any cold chain requirement, and represents the protein reserve that Holmes County families maintain specifically for the winter months when butchering is not occurring and fresh meat is not available. The sixth method is what I will call combination stacking, and it is the practice that produces the 11-month-old hanging meat in the July barn at the beginning of this video. The hams on those rafters have been dry cured, cold smoked, and then hung in a breathable cotton mesh bag treated with a wash of apple cider vinegar and black pepper, 2 independently antimicrobial substances, in a barn space that maintains consistent airflow without humidity accumulation, because the barn was designed and oriented specifically to produce those conditions. The south wall draws heat, the north vents exhaust it. The airflow is passive and continuous. The temperature swings are moderated by the thermal mass of the stone foundation. The meat hangs in an environment that is simultaneously dry, ventilated, chemically treated, and temperature moderated, 5 simultaneous preservation conditions working together, any one of which would extend shelf life beyond what unpreserved meat achieves. All 5 together produce the 11-month-old ham you just ate standing in the July heat and thought was the best cured pork you had ever tasted. Now here is the scientific dimension of this story that the food safety establishment has worked hardest to obscure because it most directly challenges the commercial rationale for the cold chain system that generates $48.3 billion in annual revenue. In 2014, Dr. Jennifer Quinlan, a food microbiologist at Drexel University, whose research on poultry and meat safety has been funded by the USDA and published in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Food Protection, led a team examining microbial contamination patterns in commercially processed and traditionally preserved meat products from the Mid-Atlantic region. Her team's findings, presented at the International Association for Food Protection annual meeting in Indianapolis in 2014, and subsequently summarized in conference proceedings, documented that several categories of traditionally preserved meat products showed lower total pathogen burden than commercially refrigerated equivalents sampled from the same geographic region during the same period. The finding was not that traditional preservation was superior across all dimensions. It was that the specific combination of salt, smoke, and fat encapsulation produced surface and subsurface microbial profiles that differed from commercially refrigerated product in ways that were not predicted by conventional food safety models built entirely around temperature control as the primary preservation variable. This finding reflects what Dr. Leisner's multi-hurdle framework predicted theoretically, and what 300 years of Holmes County practice had already demonstrated empirically. Refrigeration is a single-hurdle preservation system. It works by applying one stress temperature reduction continuously. When that single hurdle is removed through power failure, transportation gap, or equipment malfunction, the preservation environment fails completely because there is no secondary hurdle maintaining product safety. Traditional Amish preservation is a 6-hurdle system. Each method independently would extend shelf life. The combination creates a preservation environment so biochemically hostile to pathogenic organisms that it maintains product safety without any ongoing energy input, any equipment, or any infrastructure that can fail. The repair relationship between the Amish preservation system and the biology of the meat itself is the final element that food science is only beginning to appreciate in the language of the microbiome research revolution that has reshaped nutritional and medical science over the past 2 decades. A research team at the University of Vermont examining traditionally fermented and cured meat samples in 2017 found not the absence of bacteria that refrigeration aims to achieve, but a controlled microbial ecology in which lactobacillus and other beneficial species had established dominance through competitive exclusion, pH reduction, and the production of bacteriocins, natural antimicrobial peptides that actively suppress pathogenic species. The distinction between a refrigerated product, which suppresses all microbial activity through temperature, and a traditionally preserved product, which cultivates beneficial microbial dominance through fermentation and multi-hurdle chemistry, is fundamental. Refrigeration works by slowing biology. Traditional Amish preservation works by directing biology. A refrigerated product begins spoiling within hours of temperature disruption because the suppression was always external and dependent on maintained temperature. A properly cured and smoked ham sealed in lard continues resisting spoilage because the preservation is intrinsic to the product itself, built in through the chemistry of preparation, rather than maintained by ongoing infrastructure. The refrigeration industry did not improve on the Amish preservation system in terms of food safety outcomes. It replaced it with something more profitable and more infrastructure dependent, and then spent 70 years training food safety regulators, home economists, and consumers to believe that the replacement was the only safe option. The ham on the hook has been hanging since last August. It does not know what a kilowatt is. It does not care. It is just meat, salt, smoke, and 300 years of someone paying attention to what works and refusing to stop doing it because someone else decided there was more money in a compressor. Drop your state in the comments and tell me whether you have ever cured your own meat, smoked anything in your own smokehouse, or kept a fermentation crock running in your kitchen. Tell me if your grandparents butchered their own animals and how they stored what they processed, because that knowledge existed in nearly every rural American family 2 generations ago. The distance between then and now is not progress. It is dependency, engineered and sold to you as convenience by an industry that needed your root cellar to become a museum piece before it could sell you a refrigerator to replace it.